So thanks everyone again for coming. So this is the first of a number of events put on this year by the Bucknell Project for American Leadership and Citizenship about campus politics and liberal arts. And what we're trying to do is bring speakers from a bunch of different ideological, social, demographic perspectives to talk about what's going on college campuses and how we can discuss and how we can be productive and how we can fulfill the mission of liberal arts education. And so I want to start with I think, apropos for our first speaker, Professor Sam Abrams from Sarah Lawrence College. So Sam writes and has written for research for about a decade now, issues of ideological skew and ideological balance among things like college faculty and college administrators. And a lot of this research has been, like mine, sort of academic and boring. You put yourself in the public sphere and things happen, and so we should talk about that, right? So he writes in academic journals, but also writes for outlets like the New York Times and the National Review and the Chronicle of Higher Education about sort of what higher education looks like, what the landscape, what we should be doing, and what we're actually doing. So I want to sort of have a discussion, a critical discussion, and don't be afraid to be critical, about what higher education looks like in terms of discussing contentious political and social issues. And if you live in the United States in 2019, we have a handful of those happening. What that looks like, how we can do it, why we might benefit from it, and how we might do it better. With that, I can just introduce Sam, say thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you. So we're going to chat just informally for like a half an hour or so, and then open it up to the audience for you guys to ask whatever you feel like asking, whatever you want, and just sort of try to have an open dialogue about sort of what's going on and what we might be interested in doing going forward. Okay? Anything else? All right, so with that, welcome Professor Sam Abrams, and we'll go from there.
Should we sit? Should we stand?
I think we have to sit because of the microphone.
Very frustrating. As a Sarah Lawrence professor, sometimes I will actually sit in the middle of the table and just make circles talking to everyone.
Can we sit on the front of the table?
That might get weird after a while. Maybe we start this way and then we'll move around.
A little bit. Okay,
or maybe I'll
fine.
sit over here so it's less formal and I'll slouch.
Okay.
So, thank you for having me. I am very excited to be here. This campus is gorgeous. Bear with me, I'm a little under the weather. My newborn has a cold, so of course he sneezed and coughed all over me. Now I'm developing that cold. I was very excited to come here for another reason. I don't know exactly what your relationship is with Professor or President Brodman, but your president actually was a larger-than-life figure for me when I was an undergraduate at Stanford University close to 20 years ago. And incidentally, I am feeling very old. I can still remember when I moved into my dormitory at Stanford almost 20 years ago, and I think very few of you were born at that point, so I definitely can feel it. We certainly didn't have cell phones at that point. But President Brodman, in addition to being just a world-class scholar, I remember he was such an amazing family man. He was always very involved with the family. I certainly try to emulate that. But he was also really instrumental in undergraduate education and undergraduate growth. He created something called the FRO-SO-CO. Stanford has all these annoying acronyms. That was the freshman-sophomore college. And it was about getting faculty to spend lots of time outside of the classroom with students. And that has stuck with me ever since. So as a professor at Sarah Lawrence today, we regularly do things like that. Or now, as much as I can, having a baby at home. And he was really instrumental with setting up something called the SSRC, Stanford Summer Research College. So hopefully you have something like that here where if you want to stick around during a term, the school will actually take care of your housing and give you a stipend to work with professors. That's something that helped change the lives of dozens and dozens of Stanford undergrads, and I'm eternally grateful for President Brodman's support of that over 2 decades ago. So I think it's very cool that he is here. So when the invitation came, I certainly jumped. So for better or for worse, I find myself in the national and international spotlight. People from around the globe are calling me. It's very cool, by the way, when a Japanese or Chinese newspaper outlet writes about me and you try to find the kanjis for your name and then you circle them. That's kind of cool. And what really happened was that I pushed back against a student and administrative mob. I did not think this was a big deal at the time. Now that a year has sort of passed, I realize that it is a big deal. Faculty generally don't push back against mobs. And you know, I see 2 uniformed officers in the back. That sucks. That's very frustrating to me. This is a university. this is a place where we should be able to discuss ideas, argue with people, and not necessarily take it personally. I can't imagine anyone chooses to go to an institution of higher education of this caliber, and this is a world-class institution, who is a bigot, a homophobe, an anti-Semite, any of those things. Because why would you? That just is antithetical to what so much of the higher education process is like. And I think back to my collegiate years. I was in the public policy theme dorm at Stanford. It was called Castagno. And I can remember evenings where we had drag-out fights till 2 or 3 in the morning over questions of, at the time, reparations, questions of affirmative action, questions of everything under the sun. And I had my, at that time, sort of religious Jewish worldview. And I remember there was a gentleman who I should now look up now that I'm thinking about him, who was a big supporter of La Raza. We agreed on nothing, but man, did I learn from him, and I hope he learned from me. And police were never necessary. We just talked. I knew he didn't mean anything and had any ill will toward me. I certainly didn't harbor anything to him, but trying to understand each other and trying to hold our true core beliefs as important to us was also very, very important. This is something that stuck with me throughout my graduate career and then when I became a teacher. And when I was at Sarah Lawrence, I discovered there were a lot of problems. On my second or third day of being a professor, and this is, by the way, after the market crashed, so there were no jobs. This is after Bear Stearns and Lehman went under. The market was changing. It's not as if there were plenty of jobs, so if you lost one, you'd be in some trouble. And I remember I was at the president's house having dinner. I don't even remember what the point of the dinner was. But I was trying to be engaged and charming. I was trying not to say too much. And what I do remember distinctly saying was, I said, well, you know, that's a great example of the dark side of civic engagement. This is a term coined by a very progressive liberal academic named Theda Skocpol, who happened to be one of my dissertation advisors. She was actually one of Bill Clinton's confidants. She wrote a book about this, and this just talked about the fact that small groups of people can have a disproportionately high impact on what the majority thinks, does, and how it behaves. I remember almost immediately after saying that, a trustee of color across the table turned to me and said, "Say what? Excuse me? What did you just say?" And I repeated it, not thinking anything of it, and I was accused of being a racist. She then asked me how many black students I had. I pointed out that I was in my third day of teaching. I didn't know. I also didn't count. And then she asked me how many friends of color I had, which I refused to answer because that's incredibly offensive to do. And I began to shake. She didn't see it that much, but I went, oh my God, my career is over. She basically threatened my future, and I didn't know what to do. It's not as if I could get another job elsewhere. Again, the market had collapsed. And if you're called a racist and it gets out, you're toxic. No one's going to want to talk to you, especially if you're a political scientist who studies issues of race, ethnicity, multiculturalism, and how this fabric of this great country, which is still great, by the way, despite what's going on in Washington, how this stuff works. No one's going to touch you. And I was able to get out of that. The details are not that big of a deal, but I kept my mouth shut. And it turns out lots of people in college and universities keep their mouths shut. As I kept on teaching, I would have students come to me into my office every week, it seemed. And they would tell me they were afraid to ask questions. They were afraid to share their opinions. And this really came to a head during the 2016 election. And I'm not referring to when it was the general election with Trump and Hillary. It came to a head for me during the primaries. Trump was never an issue at Sarah Lawrence. He was never a factor. No one was going to really support that. It was always really, are you a Bernie bro or were you a Clinton supporter? And there was such Bernie fever that if you were a Clinton supporter and you let people know it, you were shamed. You were threatened. Students were threatened. Physically, students had their dorm rooms entered, things were touched. People were scared to say they wanted to support Hillary Clinton. Now, I'm not a huge fan of either of these two individuals, or Trump for that matter. I've been frustrated. There's no one I've wanted to support in a long time. Hopefully that will change. And for everyone in the room too. And I was devastated. I just said, this is not what higher education is about. This is not what my collegiate experience was like. And I began to realize so many students were censoring themselves. So many students were being quiet. And I realized I'm a social scientist. This is what I do for a living. I want to understand why people engage and why some people disengage. So I realized, oh my goodness, I could actually figure this out. And I could do it through statistical techniques and observation, participant observation, all the various tools that we develop as political scientists and as social scientists generally. So I began to do that, all the while keeping my head down, not really talking about it at Sarah Lawrence. So I first decided, let's look at the students. What's going on with our undergrads around the country? And what did it look like 40 years ago, or even 50, actually 60 or 70 years ago now? Well, it turns out in the 1960s, our undergraduate population, but much older, now your grandparents or great-grandparents, were pretty left of center and very, very active. I mean, this was the generation that went down south, registered voters, did Freedom Summer. This was a really interesting, important group. And they were very, very liberal. But since the 1980s, undergrads are not particularly liberal. They're more left than right. But even if you look at the incoming group of first years this year, what we know is that most of them are right in the middle. Most of them are not particularly liberal or conservative. They don't identify as that. They identify as, I really don't know, or I'm moderate. And I spent a ton of time digging into this and realized it's probably not the students. Now, there are some students that make a lot of noise. These are the ones that get a lot of attention. These are the ones that tweet or blog, whatever. But that's not representative. So I then thought, what about faculty? You always see people making a lot of noise. There are some very famous examples out in the Midwest where one visiting professor of communication asked for more muscle during a protest. You see it at NYU. And you see people like Noam Chomsky at MIT in Arizona, who, by the way, are not social scientists, being very out there on very progressive issues. And they have every right to be. There's actually nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But the question was, is this the norm? Turns out, no, it isn't. It turns out that there are some departments around the country, and in some fields, intersectional fields, things that are something studies, tend to have worldviews that it's not just scholarship, it's activism. So those courses, you'll see some activism. And then fields like anthropology, some history departments, art history, incidentally enough, or interestingly enough, sociology, which I said, literature, they tend to be very progressive and tend to talk about what they do in their classrooms as political. But for the most part, and this is after surveying thousands of faculty around the country, turns out that the faculty are actually not particularly political. Most of them don't want to talk to you. They want to go home. They want to hang out with their families. They want to talk to their cohort of peers. They want to get tenure, and they want to live in an ivory tower. They're not all that interested in the political process at all. Again, some are, but it's not a huge majority at all. So then I realized, okay, if it's not this, it's not that, it's not students really, and it's not faculty, what is it? And then I realized, oh my God, there's another group of people we never talk about. And we're sitting in their building. I walked around campus earlier today. They're in these offices here. I apologize. I'm not trying to attack any one person here at all, because I'm not. Because I will say from the outset, college administrators who face and work with students on a regular basis genuinely care about what they're doing. That's very clear from the survey data that I've done. They genuinely want to help. They genuinely want to make the world a better place, and they're very committed to doing that. But the problem is, they're overtly progressive. The faculty ratio of liberals to conservatives, on average, is about 5 or 6 to 1. Of administrators, it's 12 or 13 to 1. It's very hard to find administrators with conservative viewpoints. Why does this matter? Well, if you look at a place like Sarah Lawrence, and here, although I'm not taking pictures of stuff here, I'm not going to write about it, nothing like that. If you look at the programming at Sarah Lawrence, from the minute an undergraduate is accepted and sets foot on campus, they don't see me. They go through an orientation program, then they go through a residential education program, and they are bombarded with messages, and they're usually one-sided. I had a lot of trouble with this. Because what you realize is students are not comfortable with these messages all the time. The messages in and of themselves sometimes are problematic, often they're not, but they're not balanced. That's what I was most concerned with. So I wrote an op-ed about it for the New York Times, the very conservative, crazy New York Times, as we all know. The New York Times loved it. I was thrilled. It went through an editorial review process of some of the most liberal activist people in the country, and they said, this is important, we need to be talking about it. And if anyone from there, I'm looking at the camera directly, here's that, thank you again for publishing it. It was important because we have a problem. I meet students and they regularly tell me, here's how the world should be. Here's how we should start framing our classes. They're introduced to seminars about white privilege. I don't want to be told that. Let's not talk about that in a pure racialized way. Let's talk about privilege, let's talk about structure, let's talk about class. And I don't like the term white in and of itself. It's far more involved than that. So let's talk about that in a more serious, balanced way. I'm not saying it's something we shouldn't be talking about. I want to be very clear about that because we do need to talk about it. That all being said, I write this piece. I'm pretty comfortable with it. I'm pretty happy with it. And boom, the college goes crazy. Most of the time when mobs develop and people demand your dismissal, demand your review of tenure, people sort of just shirk or sort of shrink away and apologize. I refused to do it, largely because I didn't want to. I didn't think the op-ed in and of itself was particularly offensive. I didn't single out any one group because I have no intention or desire to single out one group. The goal was to do exactly what happened, get a national dialogue and discourse going. And I've received probably 50,000 emails and phone calls and letters about it. I've received checks in the mail from people who said, you must be struggling, let me help you and your family out. I don't know what to do when I get those checks. It's very awkward. I write thank you notes, I usually donate them. It's a little weird, but it touched a nerve. Trustees from around the country of colleges and universities came to talk to me. Students out of every corner of this country, and actually in Canada, the UK, Germany, have reached out and said, this is a problem. And what you realize is because of the sort of zeitgeist, the culture that's created, because of this programming that occurs in your residence halls, in your dining halls, in the spaces you inhibit. Remember, you're probably not spending that much time in class. It's everywhere outside of class. Students can't talk. They're uncomfortable. I'm teaching a first-year studies course right now. That's our seminar we have at Sarah Lawrence on the American Dream. And almost every student has come to me privately and told me they're scared because they actually like the course. The syllabus is actually online. It was profiled and written up in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Take a look. You'll see the course is totally balanced. It has narratives and memoirs of every shape, size, color, and demographic about what it's like to live and experience the American dream from as many diverse perspectives as possible. The readings are written by both people on the left and the right, and I talk about who they are and where they're coming from. Nonetheless, I think the students are very happy in the class, but they've all said they're feeling threatened in their dorms. They can't sleep comfortably. They're being harassed. They're being criticized, and they're being given a look of derision when they say they're in my class because they don't denounce it and say it's horrible or that I'm horrible. So, being in New York City, I'm very lucky. Not only do I get affordable Broadway tickets on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, highly recommended if you can come in and have somewhere to crash, but more than just that, I'm able to, escape a small town. I'm able to push back. People, can find out where I live, but they're not going to come into New York and bother me there. Here, it's a little harder. We're in a small town, a smaller ecosystem. It's harder to push back. But ultimately, I didn't expect to be in this fight. This was an academic study, and it still is an academic study that has gone through review boards. It's conducted with the assistance of the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. All this work has been vetted as professionally as it humanly can be. And the goal, again, is to try to understand what's going on in higher ed. This is where our ideas come from. This is where our political theory comes from. This is where our ideas about what makes society great, just, fair, all of those things have to come from. And it was very scary to me to realize that huge numbers of students are afraid to ask about it, are afraid to talk about it. And I pushed back, and the attacks are still unrelenting. The things people say about me are horrible. But I'm here because I'm thrilled to be here, and I feel I have to continue to talk about this. People are listening. Schools are doing the right thing. Professors are beginning to become more bold to say, you're right, we're not necessarily keeping balance. And by the way, you can be the most extreme liberal professor on anything you want and still be completely fair and balanced in the classroom. You can even offer your opinion, but you just need to make sure other people's opinions are there too. If I'm going to go conservative on something, I make sure I bring someone to balance that out in class. Students are beginning to push back. Students want more. but we still have to worry about an administrative class that is not responding to my arguments. I've given them dozens of opportunities to say, show me that I'm wrong, show me my data is wrong. I haven't heard from them. I've debated them, but they don't come back with numbers. They continue to sort of disregard this. And I think we can do better, and I think we should do better. And your program here, by bringing in these diverse viewpoints, and some of them, by the way, I don't like. I just want to be very clear about that. Some of the folks coming are far too extreme for my tastes, but you should hear them. And if you don't like what someone has to say, don't show up. You don't need to necessarily shout them down, just ignore them. But, you know, you can certainly listen too. I personally don't believe that words in and of themselves can harm. I think that you consider what the words mean, and you take them, and you try to interpret them and make sense of them. And then if you don't like them, say that's a ridiculous opinion, and it has no basis for it. But that's that. So I'm sorry for rambling so much.
No, it's good.
Figured I would go off on that.
Yeah, no, a couple of perfunctory points and then a couple of pushbacks.
Sure.
One, thank you for blowing smoke up a president's butt.
Sure.
It's
all
that
true,
makes
though.
Me happy.
It's
Yeah, it makes me
totally
happy,
true.
right? Because
At least to me.
I like that. So, a couple of pushbacks. So, one, you said that the campus went nuts, and there was some stuff that happened that was, you know, like the death threats, the libelous graffiti or whatever. But it wasn't the campus that went nuts, right? It was a small segment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't like.
Yeah, so
You know what I mean?
So that actually speaks to the whole dark side of civic engagement idea. It's a small minority. I just actually wrote a piece this morning for the National Review about the tyranny of the minority. Most students that I spoke to, and I didn't survey them, so I can't prove it, didn't want to be involved. But a small number of people, especially with social media, can disseminate huge ideas very quickly, and it can look very, very bad. A few faculty stood up for me and stood up for freedom of speech and the right that I could write such a piece, which, by the way, the president of the college eventually did say was absolutely within my rights to do it. She didn't, of course, want to say that at first, but she eventually conceded that, yes, I should be able to write that, and I'm free to write that, and no, you can't get rid of tenure for that. But a larger number of faculty actually signed petitions to have my tenure revoked or questioned. That was uncomfortable. But even with that, the majority of faculty didn't get involved. They didn't want to get involved. But again, we should be careful that a small number of people who are organized can make a lot of noise disproportionately and shut things down.
And so perhaps a more substantive question with this. Right? So, I mean, I don't know Sarah Lawrence's student population, but like everyone in here went to the same private high school in Connecticut, right? And so, you know, and so, right, named after like, you know, John Adams or whatever. And so, what is the, what's that?
He's from Massachusetts.
Okay, maybe there's a little geographic
Nathan,
diversity.
just say Nathan Hale.
But what is the essential issue with students getting programming that takes them out of that box, right? With them not, because they've lived in a life, and maybe it's a socially liberal life, and maybe a lot of this stuff is identitarian, and we should care about this sort of, but there is sort of like, these students are not a microcosm of what America looks like. And so what is the issue with using part of orientation, part of whatever, to just tell them that, or educate them on that?
That they're not, that they need to have broad
Yeah,
skills.
like look around I mean, you know, I don't know, right? But like, who was in public policy this afternoon? Like, I showed up to class, and someone said in the back of the room, "Hey, look, someone left a key to a Porsche in the back of the." It was like, really? Like, I was sort of surprised, but not at all surprised. And so, if we teach students about that, is that why wouldn't we do that?
We should do that. I mean,
Okay.
The whole point is we should do that. You're supposed to be uncomfortable every now and then. That's the whole education process. If it's easy, it doesn't mean you're moving forward enough. I had a graduate school advisor named Jim Alt, who liked to say if you never encountered any turbulence, you're probably not moving. You want to have your bubble burst. In the real world, in big cities, they're not all, there isn't a monoculture there. You have people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and the whole point is that we should need to respect those and understand them and be able to converse with them. And if you're in an echo chamber and you're not having your bubble burst, you may have trouble understanding it. If everyone's from Connecticut and driving Porsches, and I'm sorry you're driving Porsches, but I figured it would have been a Tesla, but if you're doing that, you're not necessarily going to have the tools to be empathetic to others either. If you care about poverty, if you care about upward mobility, you also need to be aware of people who are unlike you. It also makes life interesting. One of my favorite things about being at Stanford was just how many folks from Southeast Asia were there. I grew up because again, I mentioned I was a more religious Jew growing up. I had a fairly narrow upbringing, and man, it was so much fun to go to Bangor by the Bay with my friends from Indian backgrounds, and I loved it. I learned so much, and it was the whole point of college to expand your horizons that way. So no, you should embrace and welcome the discomfort every now and then. You should embrace and welcome being challenged, and you should embrace and welcome the ability to be empathetic and understand other people from other points of view. Incidentally, that critique or that statement should fall right in line with everything the folks who do the undergraduate orientations think and want. The problem is they're not being broad enough in defining what that means. They're not necessarily talking about religious diversity. It tends to be fairly atheist and agnostic. They're not talking about viewpoint and ideological diversity. They talk about sexual diversity, they talk about racial and ethnic diversity, but it has to include other forms of diversity as well. I actually have another paper. I'm just saying that I have all these papers because I've tried to systemically analyze this and look at this, which points out, and you can see all of these things on my aei.org webpage, where I basically say all these people talk about loving sexual diversity and loving other forms of identity diversity. But when it comes to viewpoint diversity and ideology diversity, they're not as concerned about that. My point is to say we need to be concerned with that because this speaks to all the social justice problems that they are interested in. And believe it or not, I am interested in. I'll get all identity politics on you. I'm a Jew. We have this concept called tikkun olam, repair the world. Social justice is a lot of Jews' core value systems. Of course you want to help people, but there are lots of ways to get there. Maybe growing the government and increasing social programs with the government is not the best way to do it. I'm not making a value judgment here, but from a right center perspective, in my capacity as an AI person, I don't necessarily love that. I think market forces are sometimes better. I also think that states and local municipalities sometimes can be much more effective at solving these problems. At no point am I saying they shouldn't be solved. And shouldn't be discussed. But we want to have all of those viewpoints and all of those avenues on the table, and far too often they're being limited, especially if you look at what's being presented and how it's being presented.
So let's do that for a second. So again, this is not like a flip a police jeep kind of campus, but the one sign that I saw of yours that was sort of, someone had flipped it over and written on the back, "Viewpoint diversity is a smokescreen for bigotry." You clearly don't think that. So discuss.
I'd love to get a copy of that if someone has it.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I do understand where they're coming from on that.
Okay.
I'll be the first person to admit that. I am one of the founding members of a group called the Heterodox Academy, and it's a group of, I don't want to get it wrong, I think almost now 3,500 folks who work in higher ed who are very concerned with making sure we have viewpoint diversity. And what I just talked about with all the ability to have the various opinions in the room, which again I think are essential for empathy and social progress. But I also do understand that if you look at a lot of the proponents and a lot of people who are arguing for more viewpoint diversity, they can come off like that. And it has been a cause that has absolutely been adopted by, and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. I can't wait once this is posted to watch what happens on Twitter now, but let's do it anyway. I do understand where that's coming from because there are people who've jumped on this. It looks like it's a right-wing sort of meme. It looks like it's totally understandable that it looks like it's something that's been adopted by folks on the extreme right to push back on higher education. I absolutely can see that, and I wouldn't argue that that's not happening to a degree. It's also something we at Heterodox and the folks I talk to at Heterodox are incredibly aware of. And we are working very hard on a regular basis to present it the way I tried to just present it now, which is I don't see it that way personally. I think most professors don't see it that way. And those who do, I don't think that's what it's about. Again, it's about having the ability to see from, it's really about having empathy and then having the tools to empathize with others and to realize that you can be conservative and also want to help people. You can be liberal and want to help people. And they're just different ways and different paths to getting there.
So how much of
Probably
this?
wasn't expecting me to say that. There's some truth to that.
No,
but
there is some truth, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah, and it gets appropriated in all sorts of weird,
Right, and that
crazy
sucks.
ways. And
That happens to
I
everyone.
get that. I'm curious how much of this, what's going on campus, is sort of a reflection, and I'll just do a mini rant here because I'm a political scientist, so
We all do.
it. How much of this is a reflection of the broader political environment, right? Because, I mean, we talked over dinner, and most Americans are moderate, but people who care are farther apart on issues than they've been since Reconstruction. We're literally killing each other over this. And it's not just issues, it's people are more concerned that like their kid is going to marry someone from the other side. People on the other side aren't fully human.
Can we just ask
Yeah.
the students?
Yeah.
Has anyone gotten any of that sort of feedback? If you have parents who are conservative or liberal who've said don't bring home the opposite, or have said you can date anybody under the sun but don't date a Republican,
Or,
or so the other. It could go the other way, obviously. So is that actually a thing anyone's actually experienced? I've heard it's just always nice to see that it may be true.
all the men on campus say that they have to say now that they're economically conservative but socially liberal, so they can still pick up girls. So there's that, right? Whatever, right? I think the other issue is like the sort of positive view of viewpoint diversity is the value of civil discourse, productive disagreement. We can disagree with each other and learn from each other and be better. And I can give you some stories of my own, all sorts of stuff. But we just elected a president who's not super good at that, right? And there's some freshman Democratic members of Congress who are sort of thinking that model's not such a bad idea. So, one, what can we expect of our students if we're not getting it from our leaders? And two, like, which way does the causal arrow go here? Is campus a reflection of the culture or vice versa or something else?
Got it. So campus is our reflection of the culture. I have another paper. There's your meme. Take a photo of me and just have another paper, please. But I do. And it actually was also written up in this week's Chronicle of Higher Education Educational Special. Because some of the data is really important. We do, as campuses, reflect the milieu that we're in. So it's absolutely true that if you are in a very liberal area or a city, you're going to have far more progressive administrators than you would if you're in a conservative area. Very few campuses really fit comfortably in the middle, unfortunately. So we do reflect that, for better or for worse. As for the lovely rhetoric of our current president, don't love it, obviously. Damaging so many things on so many levels. If my brother's watching this, he freaks out every time President Trump tweets. So it's very, very frustrating
We all do.
to see that. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, if anything interesting has happened in the last 40 minutes and someone's checking, let me know. I actually think that you're better than that. So one of the things I do in my capacity as a research person at AEI, and incidentally, if anyone is interested in internships, fellowships, and stuff in DC, come talk to me when we're done. We always have stuff, and we're always happy to help connect you. Is I have been leading a big project on community and society. When I joined AEI, I had a dream to sort of extend the work of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. This is a very important book about the revival, collapse, destruction of what makes community civil, what makes community work. And that book is old. I mean, he talks about TV and cocooning. The book does not talk about social media and these lovely little smartphones, although this is an iPhone 10, it's huge. And the reason I mention that is the world has changed quite a bit since when the data and those ideas were generated in the early 90s. Well, the reason I'm a little optimistic, believe it or not, is that you're not millennials. The press often gets it wrong and always talks about the bitter or disconnected, isolated, unhappy millennials. And they are, and the data that we've been collecting to study this shows this. But you're Gen Z, or what I prefer to call the Homeland generation. As we discussed at dinner, almost none of you probably remember September 11th. I do. It defined my senior year of college. I was with my mother, dealing with some issues on September 11th around New York City. It was a very, very bad day. You grew up in a different era, and the thing is, despite all the negativity and criticism about mental health issues, despite all the statements that you as a group tend to be isolated, and there's some data that shows that, and I think there's some of that's because of our social media. The data also shows something else. and that is you know how to critically evaluate information differently. You don't just see something on social media and believe it to be true. I'm going to sadly say my mother forwards me things online all the time that are just clearly made up. Love you, Mom, but the fact is they're wrong. You're more sophisticated than that as a group, and you're more engaged. A big study came out about record numbers of registration to vote in the midterms. And if we look at how you engage, you're actually far more social than the millennial cohorts. You work in greater groups, you care more. Being in New York the other day, I had a chance to take my little one to the climate march. It's your group. It's 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and presumably a few years older as well. So I'm optimistic because you are better than our president. You don't talk like that for the most part to people. You want more. And you're more willing to join groups to make things happen. That's what the data shows. You're willing to work together in a way that's very different from some of the older cohorts. And that also is why I've repeatedly just uncovered in surveys of students on college that they're also regularly complaining that they're not able to talk. They feel uncomfortable by a minority of people who sort of shut things down. So yes, we reflect a lot of what goes, a lot of the sort of disposition and discourse that comes from folks in Congress and from the president, and that's really disappointing. But my optimism is that you're rejecting that, and you've actually changed. There's an upward trend of engagement with you as a cohort compared to my bitter Gen Xer cohort, for instance.
Yeah, we're awful.
Yeah, we are. Totally awful. We also, by the way, are not represented. If you look at the Democratic primary, there aren't Gen Xers. We're not around. It's folks who are older and younger, but we're not really in there.
Okay, there you go. Awesome.
Probably a good thing.
Yeah. One last line of inquiry, and let's open it up. So let's go back to the classroom and sort of what we can do to make learning environments better. And so one specific thing I just want to ask about, and then sort of the broader question. So you took your students to a Trump rally.
I did.
And if I'm guessing, the market at Sarah Lawrence College is not that. And from what I know about you, you don't strike me as a Trump supporter. So,
I am not.
So what are you doing? And what is
It was great.
And, right. And what is the, so I'm sort of saying this kind of as a backhanded compliment, I think, but what is the learning experience? Like, what are we doing with that? And why is that?
You should go to as many rallies of people you dislike as possible. Being in New York, it's not a particularly competitive presidential state. It's not like some of my friends who teach in places like Iowa, where they get to see everybody and can, in some cases, have candidates show up to their classrooms for a meet and greet. So in New York, again, not that interesting. I have taken groups of students to the Hillary Clinton rallies, to the Bernie Sanders rallies. Some students went to an Elizabeth Warren rally in Washington Square Park by NYU about a week ago. It was a good experience. I took students to a Donald Trump rally out on Long Island in a town called Hicksville. He actually had this rally at the old Grumman facility. If any of you are space nerds, this Grumman facility is where they designed, built, and created the Lunar Excursion Module, that funny, ugly-looking thing that looks like a spider that landed on the moon. It's pretty empty now. So it has a big open space for a rally. And I was comfortable doing that because it wasn't in a particularly dangerous area. I wouldn't have necessarily been as comfortable doing it in upstate New York or in a very, very rural area, but we're talking about Long Island. It's going to be probably okay. I spent a lot of time with the students preparing them for this. I said, don't engage, don't threaten, don't fight with people, because we've seen some really dangerous things occur at some of these rallies. And I said, I can't help you if that happens. There may be violence. Don't do it. But I also want you to be there. I want you to see what actual difference is like. And in this case, what actual hatred in some cases is like. Because the rhetoric at Sarah Lawrence was assuming that if you were not a Bernie Sanders supporter and you were a Hillary Clinton supporter, you were evil. That's not okay. People are not evil for liking Hillary Clinton. I am not a big fan, but it doesn't make you evil if you have a disagreement. That level of vitriol, that level of deep, sort of guttural animosity doesn't belong. We need to change that. So I realized this was a fairly safe and interesting way to show people a very different world that they don't get to see. And after the rally, two students actually wrote amazing pieces about it that were both published in the HuffPo, talking about how it was a life-altering experience because they got to see people they never saw. That's the whole point of Viewpoint Diversity. even if there's someone who's coming here that you don't like, who seems crazy right or crazy left in any direction, there are probably people who agree with that person. There are probably people who follow that person. So the whole point is we have to burst that bubble. We have to get people out of their comfort zone. And I was a little scared, actually, because I didn't want things to go south quickly. Thank God it didn't happen, and it ended up being one of my one experience that I think students found to be really fantastic. This fall and spring with my American Dreams class, I am taking students into New York, to understand the American dream from quite a few different perspectives. Right now, if you look at how things are discussed on Sarah Lawrence's campus, we talk about Latino immigration waves, African American waves, and so on. But what about the Italian wave? The View from the Bridge by Arthur Miller. What about the Irish waves? What about Asian waves? I'm making the students come in. It should be fun. I'm not like forcing them in a bad way, but we're going to experience all of that. I want people to see everything, hear everything, and experience everything.
That makes sense. So, last question, then let's open. So, what in the classroom can we do better, right? As faculty, as students, right? If it really is just like a small group that tries to sign, like how do we make this work better, right? How do we do this without getting to the point where people are free to just spout whatever racist nonsense or whatever, but at the same time, it's not like we're constricting the Overton window so much that like this viewpoint is okay and everything else is
right. That's really tough, and it requires really dedicated teachers who have tenure, who are comfortable being stared down by people who don't like what they're doing. And there are many faculty who are doing this around the country. The Chronicle piece that I talked about earlier highlights some of those people. It also requires building intimacy with students and doing what we're actually here to do, which is be teachers and to actually educate, to lift up, to use the Greek roots, to basically set some ground rules and to say, look, we're assuming, as I said at the start, you're all here to learn. We're assuming that no one is here to be a bigot, a homophobic, racist, an anti-Semite, and things of that nature. And what I do, for instance, is I say, we're going to use a Chatham House rule. We can talk about anything, but you're not recording this. We're recording this session, but you're not recording my class. You're not recording the people in this class. We're assuming that everyone's trying to be as honest and open as possible. And we're going to talk about things. And I know all of you. You're going to know all of each other very shortly because we'll do a few activities to really get to know each other, whether it's a baseball game, bowling, things like that. I don't know if there's a bolero or something like that around here, but that's a great way. And going back to the whole bowling alone thing, you bowl together. It's amazing how quick you can come together when you bowl. It's really a lot of fun to do that. I highly recommend it because you become social. And once you begin to become social, you can't hate on people the same sort of way. I was quoted in the New York Times, and I'm not trying to be name drop here, but I keep doing it because it's important. People are listening. It's really hard to hate someone or think they're horrible if you bowled with them and you realize they're not actually horrible. They're just dumb, ignorant, or saying stupid things, and it's our job to educate and have that discourse and dialogue. But it's really hard. It's slow. It's hard to do in lectures. It's easier to do in seminars. And it requires strong presidents and strong trustees to say, we believe in doing this the right sort of way. Claremont McKenna is working hard to do that. What you're doing here is very important, and the fact that President Rodman is supporting it is very, very important. And if you, as a community, have the strength to say, enough, I want to hear about it, you can do a lot with that. I have had students over the years, because I try to create this environment in my classroom, say, stop it. We're here to learn. You don't get to shut down this discourse. You don't get to determine how we think about this. We want to talk about it. We want to read about it. And you're welcome to bring in, and I welcome this, I say this from day one, if I'm not representing a viewpoint correctly because I can't, I'm ignorant or incapable, tell me who you want to hear. We'll get this person or a representative of that person in the classroom as soon as we can. People love to do that. I mean, it's not hard. If you called someone from the ACLU, I am sure they would come here in a heartbeat to come talk, or any group of that sort of background. So it's hard. It's slow. It's not like an executive order. I can't just make it happen. But what I do sense over the last 3 to 4 years is that people realize this is a problem. Students realize it's a problem. I don't think administrators necessarily do. Faculty realize it's a problem. trustees realize it's a problem, parents realize it's a problem, people are beginning to demand more. But one of the first rules of public policy is that for real policy change to occur, not executive orders, not like how Barack Obama or Donald Trump sign things over and then they get rolled back, but real coalition building, it's slow, it takes time. I wish it didn't sometimes. But I see very, very strong progress. Schools do care about this. Not all of them, and some schools are not going to get there, but quite a few schools do care about this. The Chicago principals have become very important. And Carol Christ, who's the chancellor or president, I don't remember which title it is, I think it's chancellor, of University of California. I mean, this is the home of Berkeley. This is the home of some of the most incredible progressive protests, or People's Park during the Reagan era where there were protests and gas being used. Berkeley realizes this is a problem, and they're taking steps to try to increase viewpoint diversity and real civil discourse. So people are getting it. It's just slow. And if you have the strength to do it, I highly recommend trying. But I also fully understand how intimidating and uncomfortable it can be.
Cool. I'll end my part with a fun story. So there's two students I had in back-to-back classes last year. I don't know if they're here, but if they are, you know who you are. One of them, as far as I know, slept in like MAGA PJs. Like he was as far right as you can be, and the other one was as far left as you can be. And you know, Trump was a Russian mole and the whole deal, and like I had to prepare for right-wing conspiracy theories and left-wing conspiracy theories. And was at a football tailgate last weekend and saw them like hanging out drinking beers together. I'm like, what? Like I thought you would have. Oh, we've been roommates for 2 years. We just fight about politics all the time. So maybe we can actually.
And one of my favorite stories of that is Reagan. You know, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan didn't like each other about a lot of stuff, but they also used to say, at the end of the day, we're both Irish. We're going to have a drink together and work stuff out. That is not intended to sound like a slur in any way. That's what they said. I just want to be very clear about that, and I've taught a course on this because to me it's a great example of people who can act civilly and work together and talk about things, and I love that example. I just try not to encourage drinking because I don't know if we're really supposed to do that, but a lot of good stuff can come out of some form of social gathering, whether it is a drink or, again, bowling.
Tenure. I encourage drinking all the time.
I do too.
And you can't bowl without drinking. With that, questions, comments,
and thank
critiques.
you for coming, by the way.
Yes,
I really
also
appreciate
thank you
it.
for coming.
And thank you for wearing flip-flops
Yes.
because I'm trying to hold on to every day of summer while we still have it. So I'm grateful that people are relaxed in shorts and casual here because if I were not up here, I'd be in shorts and a t-shirt right now.
Right.
And I bought a Bison t-shirt to match my little one, and I can't wait to wear it because it's really cool. So thank you.
Awesome. All right, questions, comments, critiques.
You're not going to hurt my feelings.
Anyone? Yeah.
I'm curious if you ever had any concern that sometimes representing both sides of an issue can be a bad thing. And I'm speaking only about issues where there is an objective objective truth. So like climate denial or the anti-vax movement, which is actively killing people, and we're having measles again.
Yes, and you're absolutely right about both. That there's science. So here's me getting political. There's science behind both of these. There is a right answer, in my opinion, and I'm sorry for being so political, but in this case, we have a problem with the climate, and you know, I watched the folks march in front of my apartment about it, and the vaccine stuff, I also believe there's clear science on that. My background, incidentally, was that I went to Stanford to be a chemistry major, and I worked with someone who was the chairman of the National Science Board, which runs the National Science Foundation, and we ended up talking constantly about politics, and he recommended that I go take some public policy courses. The good news is I found that I loved public policy. The bad news is I never finished doing the chemistry, but I personally, I'm very much, you know, there are certain things where there are just certain empirical or factual truths and the question is, how do we establish those, and can we establish those? But no, you're not gonna. I would not bring in a climate change denier. I think the science is pretty clear on some of that. And yes, I'm being political, but that's my position on it.
But I guess that's part of my question, is that even the fact that to me that you have to say that's a political view is kind of problematic, because there is an objective truth to both of those things. So I guess that's my question.
But from a policy perspective, I have to also acknowledge that there is a constituency that disagrees with me on that. So the question is, what are they thinking? Why are they thinking it? And we have to understand where they're coming from to think about it. So that's how I would approach it and say, look, I don't agree with this. I think there is an objective truth. But for better or for worse, they vote. and they have some influence. So I have to deal with that reality, and that's how I would and do approach it. Even though I do absolutely agree there are certain things that are just true. But again, whether it's true or not, who's voting and how they vote, and where their power base is matters. So that's then the political side of it, again, of understanding who has the power, who has the influence, and who can get elected where to keep those positions out there. Whether we like them or not, they still have a voice. Whether it's true or not is almost secondary there. Sorry.
Thank you.
You mentioned bringing students to the Trump rally, kind of to show like what hatred really looks like and what difference it's like. But you know, those are like liberal students going to a very conservative rally. Did they come to the middle on anything, or see like maybe where those supporters are coming from?
They did, and that's one of the reasons I thought it was so great. To me, the greatest day is when a student will say to you, you know, I still am this way, but I totally understand, just like what I said, that there are people who have other viewpoints. I may not agree with them, but I have to work with them, I have to deal with them. One book that I really like is my former AI colleague's, Arthur Brooks's book about loving thy enemies. And I like it because it says, look, there are going to be some positions we can't sort of come to grips with. We're not going to find a middle ground. One example of that I've been wrestling with quite a bit is the question of right to life and when does life begin. And I've spent a lot, and I don't have, I want to be very clear, I have no position on this. I am deeply confused because a lot changes when you actually go through having a baby, and I don't know what I think, and I spend a lot of time talking about this with a lot of people. But, you know, the idea is to say, can we empathize again and understand and put our feet in some other people's shoes and just at some point maybe accept that, okay, this doesn't jive with me, but I do see that they're decent people. It's just a position that doesn't work for me. And you know, I'm grateful that I'm so confused about some of these issues. And when students become confused because of those issues, where they may say, I believe this, but I also see it that way, to me that's a win as a teacher. That's the best I can do. Because again, I have no desire to convert anyone to anything. My goal is to give you the tools that when you leave college, you can navigate this darn complex social world. You know, so many students, you may be from Connecticut, driving your Porsches. Again, I figure it would be a Tesla, or the ex-Tesla with the wings. But, you know, I also think you may not go back to Connecticut. You may not necessarily be at a hedge fund. You may find yourself in another part of the country that thinks and sees things differently. You can't be shocked. You shouldn't be shocked. You shouldn't be harmed necessarily. You should feel comfortable engaging. Again, not always, because there are going to be some people who are truly bigots, racists, anti-Semites. There are going to be some positions that are totally untenable, but there are going to be many people who are not, and we have to try to understand where they're coming from. Living in New York, there are plenty of people from schools down south that are just different, and when people interact, I don't want them to have their first interaction at 24, you know, at their job. They should be, you know, first exposed and thinking about these things when they're 17, 18, or 19.
When you first kind of push students to see viewpoints from a different perspective, so for say bringing them to a Hillary rally if they're conservative or vice versa, what's their initial reaction and how does that kind of change as they grow?
To me, it's one of the greatest things ever because, you know, if you remember Looney Tunes or whatever, Bugs Bunny stuff, you actually can see the light go on. Bursting that bubble is so important. And the reason rallies are so important is they shock and awe. I mean, that's the point of a rally. So when you see so many people, you see the pomp, and then you see this larger-than-life figure in front of you, people get it. They realize that there is some difference and that there's something real there. And when you're at a place like Sarah Lawrence, which has a traditionally very progressive sort of bend to it, and you don't have that diversity on campus, it's easy to get caught in that echo chamber. It's easy to fall victim, and I don't like the word victim, but in this case it fits, to fall victim to the pressures around you. I mean, sometimes my mother, you know, says, boy, you sound like a New Yorker, and that's not always great because I'm from Philadelphia, and, you know, there's some rivalry there. But, you know, you do become a product of your environment. So to change that environment, to force people out of it every now and then is very, very powerful. And, you know, sometimes it goes so extreme. I had a very progressive student who dressed in a very particular way, had very strong opinions. And I don't want to say wrong way, but by the end of his tenure with me, he had a bow tie on, cropped hair, now works for a very conservative think tank. Great guy, but that was a full-on all the way. I don't have any desire to do that. That's not really what I care about. It's not about conversion. It's about opening your eyes, letting you, again, empathize, understand, know the facts. I start every course, incidentally, with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's phrase, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. I, of course, change that for gender as needed, but that's something I stand by. And what are those facts? How do we get there? And how do we understand people in the real world we're dealing with and the contentious nature? I mean, people think Donald Trump has his issues, which he does, but enough people seem to like him. So we need to understand why and who they are and where they're coming from. One book that I think does a good job of that is Coming Apart by Charles Murray. Charles Murray has a lot of detractors and a lot of haters, and I understand where that's coming from. That book, on the other hand, does enlighten and explain a lot of that. And there's some subsequent books that do that too. Again, I'm not saying these are neutral books at all, but knowing who's writing them, knowing what they're showing, the ideas are important to consider. Not saying you have to buy them or believe them, but just read them and understand them because it helps open up your mind, which again is why I thought you'd come to college.
So you discussed a little bit that, like in terms of administration ratios, that it's like 12 and 13 and 1
Yeah.
left to conservative. So if we have that disproportionate ratio, how can we expect them to implement something like the Chicago Free Speech Principle?
Great question. They're very resistant of it. And one of the laws of bureaucracy, and I hope you all read James Q. Wilson's book on bureaucracy about this, it lays this all out, is that if you're as sort of an administrator, you want to keep your job, you want more power, and this is not just picking on administrators, this occurs anywhere in any sort of firm. Your group wants to have more control, and you're most likely going to hire people who are like-minded, because you wouldn't want to hire someone who's going to gnaw at you and and argue with you on a regular basis. It's easier, there's less pressure to hire like-minded people. It makes for things to be a lot smoother. I'm not an advocate of firing people. I'm also not an advocate of litmus tests. That's very scary and reminds me of Nazi Germany. I'm not a fan of saying, well, are you a Republican, or are you a Democrat, and how do we prove how what you really are? That's scary too. I think can we sort of deeply accept that we want more diversity and figure out where to do it. I also think people who are progressive can be diverse if they work harder to get there. But I also think, one of the few things that administrators said to me was, well, we may be very left of center, but we're going with what the students want. We're there to cater to the students' needs. So my reaction is, great. Students, ask for more, ask for something better, and see where that goes. The other thing I do believe that we can do to shift this is, I don't believe in an ideological litmus test. However, if you look at who makes up what people with what degrees make up most administrators, especially in this building, you can take a look, and they're concentrated in those disciplines I talked about earlier. So the harm studies, and I'm saying that in a very obnoxious way, all the intersectional studies. You get a lot of people from anthropology and sociology. And if the goal of a lot of administrators is to help their students, then we also, to play identity politics back, need to have administrators that reflect what the needs and interests of their students are. So let's get some people who have CS backgrounds, business backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, those disciplines, which incidentally are not as lopsidedly ideological. They're much more centrist. That's one way to do it. So you never actually ask about ideology, because I would hate that. That scares me to no end. I don't like that. But you have more objective social science disciplines, and that may shift it a little bit. It certainly doesn't mean you can't have a very liberal computer science professor. A lot of my CS friends are very liberal, but there also are plenty of people who are going to say, I want to shoot down the middle. This is important, and I want to advise that way. So that's the way to do it. But ultimately, we need boards of trustees and presidents to say we need more balance, and actually just declare that we need more balance. And we need students who say we want more, we want better, we want programming that's more diverse. So, rather than say, hey, let's do a seminar on white privilege, let's talk about structural inequalities and make it broad and real, and ask faculty members to have input. Faculty members don't have enough input to this. You can have totally left of center people, but make sure you bring some right of center people in, and make sure there's someone who's trying to bring it together in an objective way and say, how do we understand race and identity today? I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it. We absolutely should talk about it. We have to talk about it, but we have to, again, make sure that there are different approaches to talking about it, and I think we can demand more voices at the table. At no point am I saying let's get rid of voices. I'm saying let's bring more to the table, and that's very important. And most people, even the most lefty people, say, okay, that's fair. So I haven't been run out of town yet for that.
How would you recommend restructuring orientation residential education programs to incorporate viewpoints, or should they just not really discuss viewpoints at all and just leave that for the classroom?
So it's tough because I actually would love for us not to do it in res ed, but to be fair, many universities and colleges around the country have grown their residential education programs because there's so much going on in dorms and so much of our time is spent around dorms. And if you look at, you don't have residential colleges here, do you? Oh, you do. So there's like a faculty member or a residence dean, or I won't use the word master, but I just did, like they have at Yale. So I actually see great value in some of that because that's actually where civics can be taught and some of the life lessons about seeing other people can be taught and understanding other people can be taught because it may not necessarily fit in certain classrooms or certain curricular things. Same thing for orientation. I think orientation for a lot of people is the first time you're confronting people who are truly different from you. And I go back to the Indian example of being in a fairly sequestered Jewish community. I knew a few folks of Indian heritage, but not many. So this was the first time I had a chance to really meet people who were very different. And now I'm very pleased to say, not only do I like certain types of Indian foods, I can tell you the region or the city cuisine that I like, and I'm so grateful for that. So I also do think there's a place for that in orientation programs and in res ed. I think the deal is for the folks to say to themselves, are we getting enough viewpoints here? Just actually pause and say, is everyone going to feel like they have a place? Is everyone going to really feel comfortable? Or are we going to have a silent majority of students sort of just grinning and bearing it and feeling weird the whole time? Because we can't assume that as first years or even second years, you feel comfortable standing up in front of a room and saying, I'm feeling underrepresented, I feel marginalized. To use the very language that a lot of these groups talk about. The marginalization is everywhere, and it's a problem. So there are lots of ways to do it. You can actually bring in consultants, which I try not to do because it just raises fees. But I actually think these people can do it if they're just aware of it. A lot of times it's like with cognitive behavioral therapy, as soon as you make people aware of it, they can respond to it in a very real way. I think that's very possible. They can have some students get involved who want to get involved with the programming, and they can provide feedback, and faculty can provide feedback. One thing I say very publicly to criticize Sarah Lawrence, and I'm going to do it, is that we have teach-ins regularly about various social and political issues on policy issues that I actually am an expert in. I actually am as I said, I worked at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and now I'm at AEI. This is actually what I've spent almost 20 years of my life studying, but no one ever asked me about who we could bring in, who should we bring in, and how do we structure that. Well, that's a problem. And it can't continue that way. I'm 100% sure that there are faculty who deeply care about this, in particular faculty who are associated with this center who are here tonight. Let's get them involved. And I think you can make huge differences. But this is my Republican right of center worldview. I don't want to grow the bureaucracy or spend more money. I actually trust that universities can make that course correction because, believe it or not, as I said before, I don't necessarily think the administrators are ill-willed. I think they're in that echo chamber, and there's a huge difference.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for asking. I'm happy to talk about it. And no police needed to come in, which is
Anything
kind of nice.
else?
At Sarah Lawrence, I would have been protested already. People would have made signs and stuff.
I'll do it for fun if you
Okay.
want.
No, it's okay. We don't need that.
And I had a seminar yesterday, and I don't know how it came up, but it turned out that only half of the students knew what the word woke meant. So maybe we're sort of on the right.
But that's
Yeah.
probably a good thing, too. I mean,
Yeah.
the vocabulary is weird sometimes. I mean, I have students, and they've come to me very privately, who not necessarily have experienced or experimented or acted on anything sexual. That's all I'm going to say in that regard. But then they really tell me, why do I have to talk about my sexuality with strangers within 5 minutes of first meeting them? Why do I have to suddenly tell you what I'm into? Why do I have to, in some cases, wear a badge with my pronouns? I have a number of friends who've experimented with their sexualities. I'm not going to say who they are in any meaningful way, but when we have drinks, we talk a lot about that. And some of the most, they struggled for years. They don't want to wear a badge to describe who they are because they don't necessarily know who they are, and it's their private business that they want to resolve with themselves, their own emotional strength, and then with their partners in private intimacy. I hope that didn't come off as pervy or gross. Okay, so far no one's complaining, great. But it's an important thing to mention because this is an important thing that we all deal with. We are still products of biology. And I can't tell you how many of my first years have said, I don't want to talk about this. And yet they feel compelled to talk about it. So they're, or they feel pressured to have to talk about it, and they don't want to. So we can do better with that. We absolutely can.
Anything else? All right, well, thanks
This was
everyone for
remarkably
coming.
civil. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming. If you're so inclined, next Thursday, same time, same place, Lee Jussum, the chair and professor of psychology from Rutgers, will talk about social science research and ideology.
So Lee is one of my colleagues with the Heterodox Academy. He's going to be a firebrand. So if you want to see a much more strong presentation, it's wonderful.
He's a bit of a strange ranger. So
yeah, but
come
he's
for that.
I may look low energy. He's going to be like over the roof on it. So
Thank you, everyone.